using here.
Bernard, the point is taken. I think I had this idea with Kaushik that we could update all our links in Wiki or one of our Git projects that's created for this. So we'll take it as an action item and organize all our documents and links in one page so we can reference them easily.
Great, thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, I'll start again over regarding sort of the automation challenges which we currently see as a telco. And in order to understand sort of the situation, I believe it's good to take a step back and look at what has changed compared to the previous times where we sort of obtained solutions from one vendor. It basically was an appliance which we sort of bought and switched on and sort of made use of in order to provide end-to-end service to our customers. These solutions were integrated, and all the sort of alignment of how the different components would be working together, this was handled by the R&D departments of our suppliers. Now we've started disaggregating these solutions, and we sort of obtain the software from one vendor or a couple of vendors, infrastructure from other providers, and we need to bring them together. And the way of how the requirements of the network functions are being then sort of shared with the infrastructure providers is not well defined. There are no standards where you can simply say, given this situation, I can automate the deployment and just sort of take sort of a plain vanilla setup and directly deploy it. There will always be things like, do you have the proper infrastructure, kernel drivers, sort of network setups in place before you can actually do the deployment. Since we're infrastructure providers, telcos, we unfortunately cannot make use of plain vanilla cloud setups, but typically also have to talk about how we utilize the CPUs, pin certain sort of data processing procedures, etc. So when talking about sort of why are we sort of struggling, it's mostly because we are not very good in integration. We're providing service to our customers, but telcos are not the best integrators. And one of the sort of areas where we hope that Nephew can help us is that Nephew will help us with this integration process, both in the area before sort of the specifications hit the API and the actual instantiation takes place, as well as during the runtime lifecycle. And therefore, what we would love to see from the Nephew is a set of best practices and corresponding tools which would facilitate this integration process and clearly define how sort of the different sort of stakeholders in this process would contribute to sort of rolling out a network function and managing the network function over its lifetime. Nephew will not be able to address all the aspects. For instance, if you have to do a complex correlation of sort of tracing information, etc., I don't believe this is going to be the scope of what Nephew will need to address. But it can provide the foundation of how we can simplify sort of monitoring service assurance process on top of that. So our idea currently is based on this 3-pillar model that Nephew will basically focus on the life cycle of cloud infrastructure, the software processes, and the configuration of the software processes. And our sort of basic working assumption is that the demarcation line between Nephew and service orchestration is similar to a demarcation line between a database process and a database instance. That means, in a comparison, a network function is a software process. It needs to be configured so that it can run in this environment. But the services provided on top of that are an independent entity which needs to be managed also independently. That means in the same manner as a data process can be installed and configured without having any database instance in place, sort of the database instance on top of that, including the access rights, will have to be managed in an independent lifecycle procedure. And there we see sort of this being the domain of a service orchestrator. There are, of course, touch points between that, but if we don't have this clear sort of demarcation line in place, there will always be this gray area of, is this the responsibility of a service orchestrator, or is this the responsibility of Nephew? And as telco operators, we are not lacking management tools. We have far too many management tools, all with different approaches. And Nephew can help us streamline how these different management tools and approaches would need to work together. Coming to the first domain, network function and cloud readiness. Currently, when we're obtaining network functions, these network functions sort of are not describing in a machine readable way what kind of requirements they have towards their infrastructure. That means there's no mentioning of what kind of kernel drivers they would require, how many network interfaces need to be made available, etc., etc. And in the same manner, a cloud infrastructure would not really describe sort of how they would be able to support the requirements of telco network functions. And here, sort of this process of matching the requirements of the network functions with the capabilities of the infrastructures would be very helpful in order to align the deployment, because based on that, we could first of all determine if a cloud infrastructure is capable actually of supporting a certain workload. And secondly, given a certain requirement towards the infrastructure, before actually deploying the network functions, there could be a procedure in place which would configure sort of the infrastructure to account for instance, setting up the kernel drivers in advance before doing the actual onboarding of the network function. So this type of alignment between the requirements of network functions and the capabilities of a cloud infrastructure, automating this procedure would be highly appreciated. The second aspect is related to network function configuration.
Bernard, can I ask a question, man?
Sure, please.
The previous one, so you're looking for some standard specification for CNF or something like that, or infrastructure deployment descriptor?
Yeah, so first of all, what I'd love to see is that, for instance, the network function providers would clearly describe what specific requirements they have towards the infrastructure. That means starting from a, let's say, plain vanilla sort of Kubernetes cluster, if they need certain kernel drivers, need multos, need sort of possibilities to communicate via BGP with sort of switches and routers, etc., then these types of requirements should somehow be captured in the meta information accompanying these network functions. And in the same manner, if infrastructure is being made available, it should be possible to determine what kind of configuration options this environment provides. And based on that, determine if the matching is possible. I don't believe that we will come to standards soon, although there are activities ongoing trying to address that topic. But currently, there's no real way of determining these requirements in a standardized way. And as soon as we're saying, this is where we put this type of requirements and then start making that machine readable, over the time, we might be able to align these capabilities and sort of match capabilities with the requirements of the network functions.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Bernard?
Yes, please.
2 questions. First, what you described just now sounds, and I may be wrong, sound like the service of DSMO and ORAN. Is that what you're thinking?
So any kind of tooling would need the information first.
Yes.
Yeah, and the information currently, sort of, if I'm looking at the Kubernetes resource model, I would not know where to find that.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would love to see some kind of way of when we're obtaining this software network functions, that either as meta information along with the packages, or sort of as part of the Kubernetes resource model, we have a clear way of determining what kind of infrastructure requirements this network function might have.
Okay. And the second follow-up question is, some of these infrastructure are not necessarily traditional server. thinking data processing unit, DPUs.
Yes.
And there are efforts going on in ORAN that describe how to match the network function, the CNF, to a cluster capability and then deploying on it. Is that similar to what you're talking also?
Yes. So basically,
Okay.
if I've got a cluster, let's say there are two parts. First of all, the cluster, as soon as it's up and running, should provide information about the capabilities which it's exposing. That's number one.
Yep.
The second thing is that in addition to the basic setup, there might be the possibilities of making use of certain infrastructure operators, which might tweak the infrastructure to account for, and my favorite example is kernel modules. That means if there are certain kernel modules which might be needed for the processing of the network functions, then there could be the option that a network infrastructure provider says, in addition to the plain vanilla setup, I have the options of doing NUMA pinning or kernel module installation, etc. So this customization part would also be interesting here,
and
depending on the workload.
You see that as a potential operator, a Kubernetes operator doing that, managing the additional configuration needed.
Yes.
On an infra.
Yes.
Component. Okay. Cool.
Would be one option. I'm not wanting to go into implementation details, but just sort of thinking of saying we might have sort of an infrastructure would be capable of supporting different types of workloads. And you cannot configure sort of a cluster to address all workloads perfectly. So if that's the case, then we need to have some kind of configuration process which would allow to tweak the infrastructure to account for a specific workload when it's requiring these nodes.
Yes, I proposed something earlier last year about this, so it caught my attention. Last question, really quick. When the infra cluster comes up, the workload cluster comes up and register its capability, do you see that being registered at some sort of management component or repository capability? Where do you see it?
Yes, very good point. I'm not sort of wanting to go into the implementation details, but there needs to be a flow of sort of how I can capture the capabilities of the clusters either in advance. That means could be that when I define a cluster along with its capabilities, that this is already in some kind of repository which can be used by the Nephew processes for configuration, or I get this information during runtime. But this again, implementation options. I don't want to make any sort of decisions here regarding how to implement that.
Yes, ORAN has been working on this and has been specifying requirements on this, but no implementation. Well, at least as of March. I see correlation across a couple organizations.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that these things are new, what I'm mentioning here.
Nope,
okay.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next category is regarding the configuration of network functions. There used to be a time where sort of the suppliers sort of took their network functions, sort of customized them exactly within their own organization to meet the needs of the customers. That means sort of the R&D department also did the tweaking of the network configurations, etc., and then handed over to us, and then sort of we did the deployment and sort of everything was hopefully okay. As soon as we're now having to mix and match solutions, we are sometimes confronted with the situation that we have to first unbundle the network functions, have to understand the parameters, sort of understand which of those need to be changed. And in conjunction with sort of several network functions, there might be dependencies regarding the configuration propagation. That means if you change something in the configuration of system A, then that might relate to some kind of complex formula, which would then determine what the configuration of system B should look like. And so following aspects sort of would be nice if we could answer that. First of all, how would we start with specifying more the intent of what we want to deploy? Let's say, sort of very simplified, I want to deploy sort of a 5G core capable of being distributed over 12 regions and serving this amount of customers in parallel with a redundancy scheme of whatever, and have this intent being then mapped to the specific configuration parameters. That's sort of number one. Is there possibilities of sort of specifying high-level intent down to configuration parameters? And we're talking about thousands of configuration parameters per network function. So this is really a nightmare for anyone who is not really the developer of that network function. Then, how would we align the deployment-specific configuration service parameters related to the cloud infrastructure and a network function? That means, sort of, again, the same question. If I'm configuring the infrastructure, how does that have to be reflected in the network functions and vice versa? This is something which is already being addressed by Nephew to a certain degree. Then, sort of, if we've got network functions of different service providers, doesn't mean that sort of there's a well-defined rule of how we sort of align these configuration parameters. And again, this is more about standards and roles and responsibilities. If we're bringing things together from different providers, typically this will probably only work if we have a standard in between, because otherwise trying to integrate sort of network functions coming from different vendors will not really work very well. And then sort of just imagine that sort of we have experts in place, they know about the configuration parameters and they did their very best, but they are humans and they are having sort of also they're making errors, etc. Debugging deployment configuration parameters and identifying where the misconfiguration happened is also a nightmare, especially if you've got 10,000 different tools which you're using in order to facilitate the configuration process. That means you commit something to a GitLab repository, for instance, have certain CI/CD pipeline chains sort of doing their very best to propagate the information. At the end, something wrong is being configured in the actual deployment. The question is, where did it go wrong? At what point was that really sort of leading to this error? And having these debugging capabilities in place to quickly resolve that would be one of the things which would be great to have. Okay, I'll pause here a little bit if there are any questions. Otherwise,
Yes.
I would. Yes, please.
Yes, I fully agree with what you said about the complexity of configuration. But I think also we should also advocate to have, let's say, less parameters to be configured in our environment. Because I agree, today we have for some network function, maybe thousands of parameters. It's on. I agree with you. It's a nightmare to be sure that all align, and when you have different vendors, to be sure that every parameters are aligned is very. It's very difficult. On whatever the, let's say, the automation tools we can set in place, we still have this issue to solve and to debug and to try to understand what is going wrong.
Yes.
So, but I think for that, it's not only a matter of, let's say, of automation framework, which also maybe a matter of designing maybe a network function,
yes.
maybe to be easier to configure and so on. So maybe I think it's also a message towards the vendors to facilitate our life when we want to deploy, let's say, complex network functions. But I fully agree with you on the statement today. I can tell you, we spend most of our time, let's say, to debug this complex configuration. For example, for a 5G core network, it's let's say where we spend most of the time. It's really that to find the right values for the different CNF deploy, and it's really a nightmare. I fully agree with you.
Yeah, just one food for thought here. Just imagine that you could split the configuration parameters in two types of configuration parameters. The one related to the internal configuration of the network function, and the other related to the integration of a network function with external communication partners.
Exactly.
That means, and alone this would help tremendously to reduce the amount of configuration parameters you're looking at and sort of streamline sort of the responsibilities of if a configuration parameter in the integration goes wrong, then you don't have to take care about the rest and vice versa. So this type of separation alone would be very helpful. Okay.
So Bernard, I raised my hand. It's Wim.
I'm sorry.
Can I maybe quick? Yeah. So quickly, yeah. Okay. Let's say try to participate in the discussion here is because
Wim, I can't see the hands. So someone else has to moderate that. I can't see the.
No problem. Yeah. So the problem is I see the point, right? The challenge is I think as a vendor we all have a history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so which we are let's say taken into account somehow, right? So now you have two approaches, or you have different ways to approach the issue here. One approach that I've seen into the industry is we say we are trying to standardize the configuration parameters and try to build a common, let's say, API framework that is common across most vendors. Or we have a set of blueprints that we as operators have that would be covering, let's say, 80%, 90% of the market requirements, right? And so that is one extreme trying to build the APIs or the data model that covers basically 100% of all of that. What you typically see is that that doesn't work 100% if you try to standardize everything, okay? Because every vendor still has its own secret sauce and they want to innovate and what have you, right? Yes. So that's one thing. So, but I believe there is a middle ground into this that you say, okay, because I think we all have to participate in this journey, in this complexity. So, and my take is the following, and what I've tried to do so far in Nephew is the following. If you look to release 1, we have one CRD at the moment, CR, which is basically called NF deployment, right? So that's a CR, that is a framework that builds a skeleton on which you can plug in additional parameters that could be vendor specific or operator specific. We don't even make a distinction there. But if we try to, and I know that building APIs and these models is not easy and straightforward, but I think it will help the effort toward the vendors, because if we say, okay, here is a schema that covers, let's say, 60, 70, 80%, I don't know, of the deployments that we see outside in the world, and you have the ability to customize sufficiently to the other percent and to have vendor specifics and what have you, I think that could be a strategy that is a win for all. You see what I'm saying? Because and so far in Nephew, at least my take is to try to go into that direction a little bit, is to give you a skeleton and a framework on having those requirements, as you said. And so today we have been mainly focused on, let's say, networking, infra networking stuff. There is other set of parameters that we haven't tackled so far, right? But we have to probably do that, as well as we went into the configuration to a little bit so far. But if we could, toward the point of configuration, spend some time to say, okay, these are the parameters that we see in the most common deployment, it would, I think, help us all to get that skeleton in place.
So two things about that. Yeah, two things about that. My concern is that we try to do that in various projects to harmonize these requirements and describe them in a consistent manner, especially regarding the interface between network functions and infrastructure. And this I didn't get the impression that this process converged. And that's why I'm a little bit skeptic about sort of if we will be successful without giving a little bit more of guidance and structure in how we need to capture this information. And one of the requests I would have, and I'm not saying that this has to happen overnight, is that when we retrieve or receive from the vendors' infrastructure or network functions, their solutions, that we get a little bit of meta information in addition, which sort of says, look here, regarding all the configuration options which you have, this is sort of an internal configuration. This is an integration configuration related to the requirement to infrastructure ABC, which needs to be capable of doing this and that. This type of additional information allows us already to streamline our activities a bit. And I believe that would be a sort of a manageable effort also on the vendor side to sort of apply or make this metadata information available. And that's what I'm missing a bit, because basically we're simply always opening up all the doors, say we can configure everything because we've got the secret source approach. But sort of this is, from my point of view, no contradiction with the approach to say, okay, this might all be your secret source, but let's try to explain, try to understand, is this the secret source for your internal configuration? Is this something which allows you to better sort of integrate with your neighbors, or can we make use of other sort of information of how to do the integration with other network functions or infrastructures? So giving a little bit of guidance here would be helpful. And that's one of the best practices which I would love to see promoted also in the Nephew project. Because without structuring our problem, we will still face the complexity of thousands of different configuration options not really fitting together, and where we have all the difficulty of understanding what to do and how to bring those things together in such a way that we can guarantee the end-to-end service quality to our customers, because this is the ultimate objective which we have. We are not trying to only do a one-time integration. We want to do integration which can be changed over the time, but at the same time, sort of ensure a stable, high-quality service to our customers. And
my point is the following, Bernard. I see that, right? But there is two things. There is the vendor to operator relationship. We in Nephew here, we're trying to achieve something. So in order to help there, if we could focus on what I call the blueprints or whatsoever, right? That we see into the market. And if we succeed in defining these blueprints that are, let's say, dominating or cover the majority of the market, then having the vendors adapt to those parameters and those scenarios, I think we will probably, both what you are requiring as well as Nephew will be more successful together, is what I'm trying to say. Because if we standardize on a set of blueprints that are commonly used into the field, and we define, let's say, the common set of parameters that are needed to do so, right? Then it is up to the vendor to basically map towards Nephew parameters that are defined and help you in the deployments to say, okay, for this type of configuration, these are the parameters, and we can split between internal and external and stuff like that, as you mentioned. But as Nephew, we cannot say to the vendor split between internal and external, because we have nothing to say there. As Nephew, what we can do is define, in my view, a set of blueprints and parameters that are most commonly used, and define a data structure around that, and have the vendors adopt to something like that.
Yeah, so I'm here a little bit in the middle of, I tried to also close until 1930, that's why, or to the end of the session, that's why I'm going to speed up a little bit. But two things come to my mind. First of all, I'm totally with you that it's not like you can dictate an approach and say everybody has to follow that approach. It has to be easy to use and easy to be adopted. But I do believe that there are certain sort of mechanisms which have already been defined. In Tosca, for instance, you've got the requirements capabilities pairing, which you could potentially use. And I'm also only asking for these types of mechanisms to be available so that we can leverage the information in these types of metadata to simplify our integration tasks. Yeah, and somehow we need to get into the middle ground of how we could make use of this type of approach in a generic manner, not only for IPAM or network interfaces or whatever, but in a sort of saying, yes, those are the examples of how we can do that, but there's a general pattern behind that of how we would ideally manage those type of mechanisms. Let me, Wim, if that's okay, sorry for sort of speeding up here. I just want to close the topics so that I can finish this session, if that's okay with you, Wim.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'll set up. There is 2 more hands, by the way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
FYI.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
One is Bala and the other one is Ravi. Yeah.
yeah, I'll just so just to one thing I thought of was when Bernard was mentioning this, if there are too many parameters, internal and external, if we want to categorize as them, if I may say so. So, I mean, this is for the questions for the vendors and also the telecom service providers here. Have you thought about the principles of conventions or configuration instead of making everything configurable? Probably you can have certain recipes or certain vendors could say we will support 3 recipes, 3 or 4 recipes, and the service provider has to choose one, and we'll automatically configure all our internals based on that recipe. That recipe could be, for the lack of intelligent terms here, I can say, you know, lower latency, higher bandwidth, or things like that. So you will choose a particular template, and then all your internal configurations is automatically chosen by the vendor based on that, based on your intent. Basically, it's like policy driven in a way. So if you could do that, then that will reduce the complexity of configuration, and that will increase a little bit of work from the vendor side in the sense that the vendor has to now think about multiple configurations that is possible, and then it has to provide that higher level abstraction where the users could express, this is the intent I want. I don't want to configure 100 parameters. I just want to say, this is what I want. This is my intent. And then based on that, you automatically configure your internal 100 parameters.
Yes,
same thing with
exactly. Yes, that's why I mentioned this highlighted sentence, how to map intent into deployment-specific configuration parameters.
Yeah,
that would be something which would be wonderful for us.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think probably we can discuss that internally. Yeah.
I just had one question, Bernard. Like, I mean, I'm thinking about next steps, and I was just thinking about, you know, what the other forums have already done. Like you mentioned of Tosca or HCNFE, or in ORAN also in the last call. There was this thing that, okay, there's night work item on Kata's profile on the O2 IMS interface and so on, and there are all these bodies have specifications on requirements, use cases, and all that. Would those be good reference points to bring it into this group, so that you have a kind of a good starting point instead of redefining everything?
I think so too, but sort of one thing would be very essential for me: simplification. That means for a telco operator, sort of, I would love to start with this as simple solution as possible. And therefore, sometimes I'm afraid if we want to make everyone happy, then the solutions become very, very complex over the time. And we're, again, not struggling about having not enough management tools. We've got far too many which are not really working well together. And this is sort of making us slow, and the implementations are very expensive, etc. So I'm very open to any kind of suggestion, but simplicity will be key for any kind of approach.
Yeah, I said, like, I mean, this is a complex problem, and that's the reason, you know, they have come up with all the generic network service descriptor definitions, and probably even for network function deployment and all that.
To be honest, my favorite currently is requirements capabilities, sort of aspects of Tosca, which are really the basic ingredients which we would be needing here from my perspective. But maybe there are better ones. We'll have to see about that. I'm open for this discussion.
Okay. Yeah. No, I was just trying to understand what would be the next logical step. Thank you.
So,
hey, Rob, sorry, I have my hand raised also, really quickly.
Sorry, one moment, just one moment. Then I would simply propose that the other 3 topics we will discuss next time, if that's okay with you. Because I've got still 3 topics to present, but I will not be able to make that.
Yeah, I think they'll postpone the next topic and there's finish up here.
Yeah. Okay. So please go on, please. Sorry.
To follow up on Ravi's suggestion, maybe the next step should be and I hesitate to say this because I'm kind of volunteering for it, is to correlate ORAN and SENFE and Tosca, some of these sources, and come up with what we think is acceptable requirement set, and bring it back to this forum for the first topic today. And I'm not putting a timeline on it, but just an approach, proposing an approach. Would that be acceptable?
So this is something which Kaushik and Sana have to moderate.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say.
But I mean, would it address your requirement, your need?
Yeah. But just keep in mind, I've deliberately not tried to talk about ORAN. I've not tried to talk about 5G core. You will not see that in this description here. I'm trying to sort of address the fundamental problems which we have when we're trying to manage software-defined networks on top of an infrastructure where these solutions are coming from different parties. And in the end, we also have to ensure end-to-end service quality on top of that. So, and that's why I would not want to see a solution which only fits for a certain, let's say, 5G core use case or ORAN CU use case or whatever. I would like to have an approach which addresses the fundamental constraints which we're struggling with. And based on that, sort of, then I would regard these requirements to be helpful and valid here. But I wouldn't want to sort of make things more complex. It's very important for me to simplify our lives. Basic notion here is simplification as much as possible. And that's why I like this Kubernetes resource model approach very much, because it's really sort of boiling down to the core of what lifecycle management should actually look like.
Agreed. The reason I mentioned ORAN and some of the other sources is they have similar fundamental requirements, and I'm just trying to capture it across the groups. That's what I'm trying to do. But
yeah, it would be great if you can align on that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'll defer to Sana and Kaushik on this.
Yeah, I'll just quickly reiterate, and that's a very good point. In fact, one of the working group 1 and 2, both the working groups are expected to work cross-functionally with the ORAN and other such groups to ensure there is cohesiveness and alignment where there are overlaps in philosophies, right? So we'll do that, but internally we need to have, to the point that Bernard is making, we should have our requirements done in a way that are not specific to a particular domain or a particular use case, but overall for the telco network infrastructure, what does automation look like, right? And then we can specify those for, let's say, 5G core versus RAN. Maybe there'll be some specifics that are not applicable to all the use cases, and we should do those. But the starting point, as Bernard says, I like the approach here, right? And I would request other telcos to also have a similar approach to abstracting out the requirements at the topmost level and then detailing it out based on the use cases, the domains, and the functionalities over a period of time.
Mm-hmm. So I believe time is up. So I'm not quite sure, Kaushik, if we should have a second session for that, but Sana was also presenting her details, I guess. And
I'll reach out to Sana. We should do maybe sometime next Monday or so, because we need to make very quick progress on gathering these requirements. I have also started to ping Verizon, TIM, Vodafone, and a couple others who are not as active in FEO, but I would love for them to contribute to the requirements given their interest in FEO. So let's do yet another session next week. I would separately, once the requirements are collated, we should agree on the common denominator across all the telco requirements. And then that feeds into the working group 3 for defining R2 scope. We need to really act fast. I will work with Sana to get something scheduled for next week. In the meantime, we will work with other telcos to also gather additional requirements using this template.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, if you have, again, for those of you who joined after in the last, half an hour or so, in case anyone joined late, we are still requesting nominations for the working groups. The link is posted on the SIG1 channel, Slack channel. Especially working group 3 and 4 need more participation from community. So we will, Sana and myself will make a decision on the structure of these working groups by end of this week. But if you could self-nominate yourself, that will really help us. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Coach.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Wim, by the way, did you start recording or did it automatically start for me?
I'm not logged in as admin this time because
okay,
it's always a mess.
I think it started automatically with mine. Okay,
okay. You will be the one. But if you upload to cloud, it should be fine, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Wim.
Yeah.
Hey, Vim, do you have a minute? Oh, I guess not.